Hello and welcome back, and that's right, it's finally time to review this, the Zimacube 2. And as we've spoken about on the channel for a while, indeed, the original iteration of this device that arrived on crowdfunding over on Kickstarter did pretty well, arriving in a couple of different iterations. Alongside that, the development of the software, ZimaOS, that went from free community software that everyone could use, now into a free and a paid lifetime subscription model at $29. This is a brand that we can no longer evaluate as a kind of indie startup in any regard. This is a premium solution. This is going to traditional retail via their own website, and therefore we have to evaluate it very much in that frame of mind. Now, the brand themselves are profiling this is more than just a NAS solution. They are saying this is a self-hosting powerhouse, arriving in the standard model that we're reviewing today, but a Pro Series model that we're going to talk about with three different prices, rocking out at $799 for the standard class model, $1,299 for the Pro Series model, and a stomping $2,499 iteration, which arrives with an RTX graphics card, 1 TB of storage, and 64 gig of memory in DDR5. This standard class model run with 8 gig of memory, a 256 gig OS SSD, and rocking out with an i3 processor inside. The TLDR, the design is great. They've definitely improved on the cooling concerns on the original crowdfunding model there. Performance, great. Feasibility, what you're getting for $799 is pretty bloody good. It is metal all the way around, although these little vent panels on the front and back are plastic. We're talking about a 6 times SATA. Let's get that front panel off there. 6 times SATA and 4 times M.2 NVMe and 2 M.2 slots there inside on the non-Pro model. Arriving with that i3 6-core processor there, 13th generation. It also arrives with that 8 gig of memory that can be upgraded to a potential 32 gig with SODIMM memory, not pre-soldered, thank God. This system also arriving with USB 4, but not with 10 gig networking, and we'll circle around to that later on. Ultimately, in 2026, the Zimacube 2 isn't quite the value proposition that the original was, because things have changed. We have seen a lot more solutions arrive in the market since the original Zimacube with larger scale support of SATA and M.2s. Look at things like the U-Star series, or even some of those from Minis Forum. But this is probably one of the best turnkey solutions of that ilk that I've seen, thanks to ZimaOS's continued development there in the background. Ultimately, as I say, the TLDR, this is a solid solution where the software still needs to catch up with the hardware, I would argue. But let's get on to the meat and potatoes of this review. Now, I've always been a fan of the design of the original Zimacube, and they've not changed much there, and I'm quite pleased about that. Measuring about 220 to about 225 millimeters in every direction. This thing is great. Again, in terms of physical design there, all the way around the edges. I still don't like how awkward it is to get into the main storage space. You kind of have to push hard at the bottom. There's no handle, there's no eject release, there's no locking mechanism, there's also no locks on the individual trays, something I don't really like. But how often are you really going to play around with that? And it's more of a small issue I've got. The trays, not click and load, they do feel just a little bit cheap. They are metal, but they don't feel particularly robust. I imagine them getting bent up quite easily. And of course, if these get too bent up with regular ins and outs and larger drives, not that you should be swapping and changing drives too much, they have the potential to get a little bent up and therefore misdirect into the trays. It's a very, very small percentage chance, but it's just something to be aware of, particularly if you end up changing from hard drives onto something like SATA SSDs, where if these get bent up, that could screw up the alignment of that drive in there. So just be aware of that. The 7th bay is where those M.2 NVMEs live. And again, although you can't hot swap them, wrong screw for that, you can't hot swap this tray here for those M.2s there. I will state that I still love the design of this. 4 2280 length M.2 NVMEs, you don't have to fully populate, and the kit arrives with the heat sinks, all of the screws, screwdriver, all of the cables, everything you're going to need. It's all in an accessory kit along with an external PSU that we'll touch on later on. I will highlight as well, that tray, you may see it there at the top, it has a USB Type-C. Sadly, I'm not able to interface with these 4 drives via that USB. I went in and connected it via a USB 4 connection to try and see if I could mount the 4 drives there, just in case it would be quite nice to be able to use it as a failover or as a local backup perhaps. Unfortunately, no, I couldn't get it to be seen. Disk part, Windows Disk Manager, none of that would not appear. Still, not the end of the world. Each of those trays, by the way, those M.2 NVMe's, they are on a Gen 3 x 1 speed, at least in this one. The Pro Series model scales that up, but you're going to get something like a little over 800 megabytes per second for each of those M.2 NVMe's, and they are being managed, by the way, by their own individual controllers. Hopefully you can see that on screen. ASM2806, 4 individual PCIe controllers for those managing the throughput all the way through. And the SATA drives, by the way, are feeding into a Gen 3 x 2 controller, the ASM1166. Not everyone's cup of tea, I will say. I remember the original iteration of this device. Do check out Hardware Haven's video on that one, I believe from early last year. May even been 2024, my God, time goes fast, where he talked about some PCIe switch placement that throttled things. They have resolved that, by the way, in later iterations of that device and in this one, but still just something to maybe check out for the old history of the thing. But those aren't the only bays. Inside there's an M.2 NVMe slot that's occupied by a Kingston SSD that's included, which has your operating system. But alongside that, there is another M.2 NVMe slot in the non-Pro model that's barely mentioned anywhere. Now, in the Pro Series model, if it's anything like the previous generation model, the previous generation Zimacube Pro, that M.2 is almost certainly going to be occupied by an M.2 into 10 gig adapter. That's what the previous generation Pro had. But in the standard class model, this device has just 2 2.5 gig networking ports there on the rear, which means that other M.2 is completely spare and usable for other features and services. Those PCIe are Gen 4 x 4 and Gen 3 x 2. So just be aware of that what you're getting with those PCIe's. There is a limit of bandwidth of what you can do with that i3 processor. Again, things are different between the Pro and the standard class model, but just be aware of that. But when I talk about those 2.5 gig network ports and how much I would like to add 10 gig and possibly lose one of those PCIe's, it is worth remembering this device also has 2 USB 4 ports there. And those USB 4 ports, well, they do some interesting things. Number one, I was able to attach a 10 gig USB 4 adapter. This is the QNAP 2 x 10 gig to USB 4 adapter. I connected this, no additional drivers needed. It was visible, and I was able to add 2 10 gig network ports to the standard class model without losing a PCIe thanks to the USB 4 ports. But it doesn't end there, because I was able to take the Mac and then directly Mac interface between this device directly and a USB 4 connection. That meant that this gave me a 20 gigabits per second connection. So again, same as this box, just with one cable out of the box with my Thunderbolt 5 Mac. But of course, USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 would do the same. So you are able to interface directly with this point to point and on the local area network and scale up the 10 gig nits if you need to. And when you've got things like PeerDrop and some of the other featured facilities that directly connect this via the storage. For example, I mounted here on the Mac the OS drive there inside, and the OS drive is on a Gen 3 x 2 slot, so a potential 20 gigabits per second connection there. I was able, via Blackmagic, to easily hit around 1600 megabytes per second read and 1300 megabytes per second write. They're directly connected via that connection there. At the same time, you can wirelessly connect to this device. You can connect to it via those 2.5 gig NICs, and all of those devices going into this with a potential 20 gigabits per second connection bandwidth afforded to the 6 SATA drives, and we'll get onto performance later with SSDs. And those M.2 NVMe's, even though they are on Gen 3 x 1 each, once you aggregate them together, you can get a little bit more performance. But I can already tell a number of you thinking, so much hardware packed in this tight, what about heat, what about noise, what about power consumption? Let's tackle noise first. I had the system built up in 3 different configurations. When I had 6 SATA SSDs and 4 M.2 NVMe's and the main drive, the OS drive operating as well, noise levels were reported whilst in idle of around 33 to 34 dBA there, when I had the system up and running for a bit. Now, when I took away those SATA SSDs and replaced them with a pile of SATA hard drives, but keeping the rest of the configuration largely the same. Obviously, spinning drives, a little bit more vibration passing through the system and ambient noise. It's at around 39 to 40 dBA all the way through. Now, returning to something I mentioned earlier on, because you don't have access to the cooling on this system with control without BIOS, and by that I mean that the fans in here have temperature sensors inside that will spin up and spin down the RPM of those fans as the system requires, and there's a larger cooling fan inside as well for that CPU. I was slightly worried about noise on this system when those fans go high and relying on the sensor. Some people just like to have a level of control of fans outside of BIOS, and sadly this doesn't present that, at least at the moment from what I could see. So when the fans are at their highest, and when I actually had to force the system to increase those fans, with the fans in higher operation, the decibel sat around 42 to 44 dBA. Remember, that was when I had the SATA SSDs inside, not the hard drives. Once you've got the hard drives, you can add that up a bit higher. It'll probably hit closer to 50 dBA. So just keep that in mind of just how much is getting crammed in here. How did that translate into power consumption? Well, returning to that original setup, we get our SATA SSDs back. When we had the system in idle with the 6 SATA SSDs and 4 M.2 NVMEs all just waiting to go, power consumption was only around 33, I think it peaked at 36 watts, so not too bad. Now with that same configuration, I then decided to crank that CPU and the RAM up. I went into Handbrake and started getting it to process a large number of files and start converting them there. And that was with the CPU sitting at 90 to 100%, and even the RAM utilization 70 to 100%. That's all power consumption, go up to about 66 watts. Remember, that was with SATA SSDs that aren't going to consume that much power. What about when we swap those out, however, for those SATA hard drives? So again, SATA hard drives with those M.2 NVMEs in place. We saw the system in low write mode. So again, that was with synchronization taking place and really just the drives being utilized rather than heavily written. We saw the power consumption of around 60 watts. And when we saw heavy write operations with data being carried around, we saw the power consumption per drive. And again, that is going to be hugely reflective of the drives you choose to use. Remember that, because you're going to need at least 3 to 5 watts for general standby and readiness, and it can go up to about 8 to 10 watts for larger drives for heavier use. With drives being accessed all at the same time and the CPU utilization high as well, we saw it hit 73 to 74 watts. Now, keeping that in mind, this is a greedy system in terms of power. That CPU is a little modest compared to the i5, but this thing arrives with a 247 watt external power brick there. It's very small. I can understand why they didn't factor it in terms of its design, and they went for the external power brick. Also, it uses a slightly different barrel to some of the systems we've seen in the past. It's a thicker, far more laptop stylized barrel there for that power delivery. So again, keep in mind this thing with that i3, which is already sitting, I think it maxes at 50 to 55 watt TDP at the top end, but it is a much more adjustable processor. You're going to see higher numbers on the Pro. You just are on that i5 one. I reckon it might crack 100 watts once you utilize it more fully with mechanical hard drives inside. So just bear in mind, this ain't no Intel Alder Lake Twin Lake system like the N100 based original non-Pro model. But what about temperatures during all of those tests? We had the system up and running for about 24 hours with intermittent access to monitor those temperatures after the 24-hour period. The front panel of the system where the drives are sat around 33 to 34 degrees, and over the M.2 sled just 30 to 31, largely based on the fan behind it being directly angled towards it there. The top panel there, the CPU with that improved cooling system with the vent vapor chamber pulling air through. At the front was only 37 to 38 degrees, and the side panels of the system only sat around 30 to 33 degrees, although over the ventilated areas we could see inside temperatures getting to 39 or 40. And on the rear, where the air is drawing out, and of course where the physical connections are. That's at around 44 to 45 degrees. So reasonable temperatures. I'm not going to say like crazy refrigerator low, but definitely nothing I would be concerned with at all in terms of any highs. And the cooling system has definitely improved over the predecessor. Now, what about performance? Now, it would be very easy to write off performance on this system being just a couple of 2.5 gig NICs there on the rear, and therefore meaning that performance can really only hit around 500 to 600 megabytes per second via the default network port. But thanks to this system having those USB 4 outputs, which support direct connectivity, I'm more than happy to include that as part of the default base testing, rather than adding a 10 gig card that you'd have to buy separately in order to hit anything. Now, utilizing that USB 4 connection, we saw some interesting things. Number one, when we took advantage of SATA SSDs inside, so again, that's 6 SATA SSDs all RAIDed together via a USB 4 connected Mac, we saw performance in read of around 1070 to 1200 megabytes per second read, and around 768 to 800 megabytes per second sequential write there. And again, that was over a period of time using Blackmagic. Now, with just the M.2s, so again, even though other drives were inside, we RAIDed together a couple of M.2s into a RAID 0, and then from there we saw performance via that USB 4 connection hit a nice steady 1600 megabytes per second read and around 1000 megabytes per second write, fluctuating there 1100-1200 occasionally. So again, thanks to that USB 4 connection opening things up, but it does look like really that's as high as we're going to get. Finally, as mentioned with the OS SSD, that saw around 1600 megabytes per second read and around 1300 megabytes per second write. Blackmagic 1 gigabyte repeated test file there. And finally, when it came to using SATA hard drives, we saw once they're all RAIDed together, in terms of Blackmagic 1 gigabyte repeated test sequential read, at just around that 1000 megabytes per second point. And in terms of sequential write, around 700 to 800, but it was a little inconsistent, not unsurprising with mechanical hard drives there. Ultimately, peak performance is possible, but just bear in mind once again that all of these numbers were achieved with a USB 4 direct connection. They were not achieved with the default 2.5 gig network ports there, and you will have to scale up towards 10 gig if you don't plan to use Thunderbolt or USB 4. But let's talk about the software this system arrives with, ZimaOS, because once again, ZimaOS has become a paid platform, and although it is freely included with this, a lifetime license for ZimaOS is included with this system, ZimaOS is no longer the totally free, totally community Casa OS that it once was. ZimaOS has become a premium platform, and we need to judge it as such. So let's dig into ZimaOS. Back when ZimaOS first launched, it was just a respec really and a retuning of Casa OS. It felt really like a Docker container wrapper, but I would argue now ZimaOS has become slightly more than that. It's still not perfect, and I'm still hesitant to call it a NAS operating system in the same way you refer to things like TrueNAS or Synology DSM for their own qualitative purposes. But everything from managing individual connections, individual user access, managing your system, things like scheduled power on and off are now being factored into it when you need it. Alongside that, managing the individual bits of storage with multi-RAID functionality and multiple pools all being built in there. Functionality towards UPSs, managing your individual network connections. And again, I will get onto these two cheeky little connections later on. But ultimately, you are looking at a more fully filled and multi-purpose NAS operating system. It does have its gaps, we'll get onto in a bit, but between what you can access via the browser there, accessing the local area network, or setting up remote access, utilizing the services that are built into the system. So if you choose to, you can set up remote access to your system pretty easily. Again, you go in via the network there and you can set up a remote access profile for your device. And again, setting that up with a Zima account and then utilizing the Klima client application to factor in and access, again, via Thunderbolt, via the local area network on the wired or wireless connections, or remotely via the internet via that connected ID you've created. And again, connecting that to local access file explorers or utilizing the one that's built into the browser window, again with full contextual right-click options and adding third-party storage platforms and third-party NAS devices on the local area network via their IP, And again, there isn't a huge number of cloud services, only the big three, but I think a lot of users would like to see a little more expansion into some of those services. But again, accessing it very easily, whether it is the OS drive and its own storage, that's something I actually think I should touch on a little bit more. When you are looking at the storage of your device there, so if we go back into the RAID settings there, I've already created a RAID pool with a bunch of SATA SSDs inside, which you can expand by adding drives if you choose. But again, you've got the individual drives all labeled here at the top. So for example, we can enable a drive if we choose and then add it, or create an existing, add to an existing RAID pool if you like, or create a brand new one from scratch. And pretty much all of the standards are there, but again, you are limited to BTRFS here. There is no support for ZFS at this time. And although you can kind of add ZFS pools, it is more based on the command line, and I wouldn't call it ideal. Again, formatting drives that have already got partitions all on side there is very straightforward. You can do that in the background if you choose, or just let it do its thing, and as soon as that's ready, you can start creating and adding that to a brand new pool with ease. So for example, going for a RAID 0 pool there, we can go ahead, add the drives that we still might have available for use. So we can go ahead and maybe add those into a RAID 0 pool, and we can go ahead and add them and create them. I'm not going to do that now, but as you can see, we've already created our areas of storage, and then from there we can monitor them, format them, enable access, and start migrating data over to them from the main OS drive. That is right. The main OS drive isn't just an operating system. Unlike a lot of other NAS brands, again, TrueNAS for example, where the OS drive is only for the operating system, and I do see the benefits of that, the ZimaOS OS drive is also used for storage. So you're not losing, for example, 128 gig or a 256 gigabyte SSD, where the operating system is single-digit gigabytes. You're not missing out on storage. You can use the operating system drive for storage as well, for core important storage, but you can also migrate it directly onto the external drives or the main storage pool if you choose to. And remember earlier when I mentioned the 2 network connections there? Well, this system isn't supposed to have 2 more 10 gig connections. This has a Thunderbolt connection, and I'm directly connected via Thunderbolt here. I've got this connected to a Mac system, and I'm connected to it wirelessly right now via the Wi-Fi connection. But I do have, and hopefully you can see it on screen, a Thunderbolt, a QNAP dual port 10 gig Thunderbolt adapter connected to the other Thunderbolt port, and it's allowed me to see the 10 gig connections. I can use these 10 gig connections. It even appears via PCIe with the Quantia network controllers, both of them on a Gen 3x2 lane each. So that 20 gigabit connection that a direct Thunderbolt connection provides is also seemingly utilized, though can be utilized for Thunderbolt adapters there for network upgrades, which is a huge plus to those that are not considering the Pro Series model, which lacks native 10 GBE. At the very least, you can add 10 gig here without using up those PCIe slots. Additionally, when it comes to backups, there is a native backup application, but I will say it is a little bit underwhelming. So for example, we can select our source, so we can go for the Zima storage, and again, we can navigate and add cloud storage variables. So for example, if there's a NAS on the LAN that we want to manage a backup with, or we've created cloud storage that we want to back up to and from, we can do that, even a connected USB drive to the Zima system if we choose. But for now, let's go for the ZimaOS storage. Let's select the downloads folder, and then from there we can select the destination, and again we can manage those backups from within the NAS, the ZimaOS NAS if we choose, or we can go ahead and use those targeted systems for backup. When it comes to utilizing the Zima client, we can go ahead and create a backup operation, for example, between this Windows system and then directly onto the Zima backup folder. Click Start, and it will do the backup in the background. However, there isn't much in the way of scheduling. There's no option here to allow me to schedule this backup regularly. I can stop the backup, pause the backup, create file versions and set rules there for what happens when there's conflicting files. But that's really it. It seems maddening to me that I can't set a schedule on that backup operation. And you can overview multiple backup ops if you choose, but it's a real shame that I can't schedule them with ease. Now, adding applications and services, again, these are all containerized, but there's a decent number in there. The multimedia players are there. On top of that, we've got other options here for adding third-party remote access protocols and VPN protocols if we choose to. So, for example, adding Tailscale there, and it's worth highlighting that the, get rid of that while it's doing its backup up there for the individual files. When it comes to accessing this device via the client application, it is utilizing zero tier. If you're going for the direct access portal with Thunderbolt, it does have zero tier natively built in, but it doesn't have VPN out the gate in the same way we're used to. There's lots of apps and services here that we can choose to use, and good God, there's a lot of AILLM stuff shoved in here, and it's all optional, don't worry. But still, nonetheless, I would have liked to have seen a lot more VPN client and at least VPN support actively kind of built into the GUI here for me to take advantage of. And again, you can use PeerDrop here, which, as you can see, PeerDrop connects individual systems that are all connected to the Zimacube NAS with that client app. So I've got a Mac and I've got a Windows system here, and it's as simple as just selecting what you want to do, select a file, and you can PeerDrop it over to the other user, and then that appears on their system. I did it already, sending a Mac file over to this Windows system. It's really, really straightforward. It's nice and easy to use, and it's natively built in, and it takes advantage of peer-to-peer. So again, you've got that option, and that extends, by the way, to using other devices which support the client on the local area network. But there's no avoiding that the way VPNs are generally integrated into a lot of NAS operating systems isn't quite the same here. And although you can add apps and services, I would have liked to have seen just a native click, add my VPN credential, bang, done. That said, the system does arrive with a native virtual machine appliance here. It arrives, or at least this system did, with a Windows 10 trial pre-built. Again, perhaps because this is a review unit, I'll have to look into that. Maybe this won't be the case for everyone. But interestingly, if you want to add a brand new VM, you can access the download repository of ready-to-go, downloadable and deployable host operating systems and their boot disks. But otherwise, you can go for a custom install that allows you to stage by stage add the amount of system resources and disk that you've already uploaded in multiple formats supported with the VM to be deployed on this system easily. And again, with standard contextual right-click options, it's nice that you've at the very least got a deployable VM tool here, especially if you're going to be running, for example, different operating systems, say for Windows or Linux. They're in your Mac OS, where you want to take advantage of some of those operating systems that some of those bells and whistles have not extended over to Mac OS. And when it comes to utilizing ZimaOS on a Mac or a mobile, currently only available for Android, I will say the Mac experience is 10 out of 10, the same as the Windows one. Pretty much every single feature, configuration and control was available to me to be used within the Mac UX, whether it was using the client application or just accessing it via the web browser there. And adding files and the Thunderbolt direct connectivity was all seamless there. The mobile experience, it's a good enough mobile application, but it still feels a little buggy. Sometimes the CPU and the RAM wouldn't display when I was looking on the main desktop there. Some of the apps and services couldn't be used in the mobile experience when they could in the desktop. Some of them obvious, like VMs, but other ones I would have expected. Same as installing applications and more. PeerDrop and stuff like that work great, but the mobile experience does feel ever so slightly hinky at times. It's still very good, and at least being designed in parity with ZimaOS, but the mobile app needs a little bit more work, but the Mac experience was pretty flawless. All that said, there are gaps that are still waiting to be filled. For example, I can't control the fans. I really hoped this iteration of this system would allow me to control the fans, but I can't. I can go into device info and find out more information about it. I can configure some of the bells and whistles there in the background. Hell, I can go right the way down to some of the hardware variables on networking and storage, but unfortunately, if it comes to managing the fan beyond its automatic spin up, spin down, depending on temperatures, I've got to rely on BIOS there, and I hate the idea I've got to do that. This is their own in-house built hardware and in-house built software. I get that fan control when you're using ZimaOS on its own you know, you've paid for it or whatever using your own hardware, maybe you can't get fan control. But when it's their software on their hardware, I would have liked to have seen fan control natively. Same goes with resource monitoring there. Resource monitoring on this does still feel slightly lackluster there. Again, I've got those options there built in to see what's doing what. I can find out what's being used by what application and service, and I can open it up into this, frankly, rather intimidating resource manager here with bells and whistles of what's going on. I'm not going to call this particularly user-friendly, and it is something of a culture shift when you move away from this onto going into some of their other apps and services. They need a resource monitor to be natively built in and with the same UX as the rest of ZimaOS. There's no security scanner. Where's the security scanner that tells me ports that I've left open and shut? When I've, gone into here, when I've been dicking around with this in the background, I've still got SSH open. This should either be on a timer or it should tell me that SSH is still open. There's just little things that I think a security scanner will do a very good job to include. The same goes with the lack of 2FA OTP. Two-factor authentication should be native here, and although there are elements of it when setting up the remote access, it's not natively built in. I don't have an option there to ensure that I need to have two-factor authentication built in. There are containers that you can install, apps and services that will add this feature, along with adding improved hardware monitoring tools, improved security scanning, improved things, but these are all third party. And I do think ZimaOS, now they're starting to command a price tag for it. I'm not going to say it's much. $29 for lifetime is fantastic, but I will say we're getting to a point where I want to see a lot more in-house apps and services and quality of life tools. That said, ZimaOS, for the price and even at entry-level free, is still a great platform, and it is growing. Not growing fast. They are nailing the fundamentals, and now they've nailed the fundamentals. They seem to be gathering steam. It's a good platform, and although I'm willing to bet a lot of users that go for the Zimacube are going to immediately hop, skip and jump onto TrueNAS and the like, therefore there is a debate to be had about the time, energy and resources that Icewell should spend on ZimaOS on this system. I will say I really like what I see here. The Zimacube 2 is a fantastic central home lab. It is. It does a lot. It has scalability and expandability in a number of different directions. The Zimacube 2 non-Pro edition is still, for me, the better choice of the two options, I will say. $799, once you factor in inflation and compare it against the original Kickstarter pricing of the $599 and $499 original, makes a lot of sense as far as I'm concerned. It's not perfect and the software doesn't feel finished yet, but in terms of hardware and design, frankly, the big top three names in the world of network attached storage, your Synologies, your QNAP, etc., they are never going to produce a design like this. The closest you'll ever get, QNAP had that 973AX series there, which combined a little bit of this, but nothing in the market from those turnkey established brands is ever going to be like this. This is one of the better examples of what we're seeing coming out of China in terms of turnkey, true turnkey NAS solutions. And although this hardware configuration can be compared to things like the Ustar, that is still OS free. This is a combined solution with an evolving network software and support of the features people want, whether it is deploying AI, and they now do have OpenClaw as a deployable application. But alongside that, turnkey NAS solutions are becoming more affordable, and this is a great example of that while still maintaining a great hardware. But just keep in mind, ZimaOS still needs a bit more work. The hardware will feel a little pricey right now compared to some of the options in the market where they're factoring in the software and development. And if you are looking for something that is perfect and ready right now, this might not be for you. But this is bloody close with great hardware design, great construction, a ton of storage, a ton of expandability, a ton of connectivity, and definitely a scale up over the original. But just keep your expectations, geared towards what this actually is. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. There's links in the description to get hold of a Zimacube for yourself. And, they are affiliated links. That's how we keep this channel sustainable. These videos don't make that much money in ads. I'll tell you right now, they do not touch the sides, and therefore we have to rely on affiliated links and commissions to keep the lights on. So if you found this video helpful, and if you want to get hold of a Zimacube for yourself, please use those links in the description to do so. We get a small commission. It allows us to keep doing what we do, but only do it if those two things are true. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.